So welcome, dear friends. I'm Father John Deere, and this is a program with the Beatitude Center for the Nonviolent Jesus with a very special guest today, my friend and hero, Shane Claiborne. So just a few basic reminders, and then I'm going to say a prayer and say a little bit about Shane. Then I'm going to hand it over to Shane. So again, I want to ask everybody to mute themselves and to stay muted, but feel free to write any questions or comments in the chat box for Shane. And I really encourage you to ask Shane questions. Pick his brain, ask him everything you can think of. He just has so much experience. And I hope you can talk up to 45 minutes or longer, whatever you want, Shane. And then we're gonna have questions and conversation. And then on Monday, we will send out the Zoom recording link if everybody would like to listen to it again. A little plug, by the way, I hope you all, if you didn't see my long interview on Democracy Now! About Thich Nhat Hanh and Archbishop Tutu, you can find that today on the homepage of democracynow.org. I just want to begin with a little 2-second prayer, if you can stand it. So just invite you to take a moment of silence and enter into the presence of the God of peace who loves you infinitely, wildly, unconditionally. And let's welcome the nonviolent Jesus here into our hearts and our circles and ask for all the graces of peace and love that we need. God of peace, be with us now as we reflect with our friend Shane on the life and way of the nonviolent Jesus and how we might subvert violence and end the death penalty and gun violence and war and racism and greed and environmental destruction, and do our part to welcome a new culture of peace and justice and compassion, to follow the nonviolent Jesus faithfully every day of our lives, to be your holy beatitude peacemakers, your beloved sons and daughters. In Jesus' name we pray, amen. So, dear friends, I'm really happy to introduce all of you to my friend Shane Claiborne, who Shane, just don't listen to any of this, okay? I think he's one of the most well-respected and rightly so, young evangelicals, period, in the nation. He's a founding member of the Simple Way, which you may have heard me talking about with him. It's a kind of a Catholic worker type community in the inner city of Philadelphia. He's the author of several amazing best-selling books, which I hope you all get. The Irresistible Revolution, Beating Guns, Hope for People Who Are Weary of Violence, and one of the greatest books on the death penalty called Executing Grace, How the Death Penalty Killed Jesus and Why It's Killing Us. And he wrote a famous book called Jesus for President, which was a little over the top, Shane. But Shane was in Iraq in, I think, 2003, and hopefully he'll tell us some of that as the US war began. And later we visited Afghanistan together. And a few years ago, gosh, it's about 5 years ago now, we were arrested together with a group of our friends protesting the death penalty at the US Supreme Court. We had a couple of rough days in jail together. And last week, Shane was arrested again for protesting the death penalty at the Hart Senate office building. You can tell us about that. A couple of years ago, he launched a really great project, which he's going to talk about, which I want everybody to go online and study, redletterchristians.org. It's great. And in recent months, and I hope he'll talk about this too, he's done a lot of great work teaching and denouncing Christian nationalism, which is what's been happening to us forever, but mainly in these last years as the churches move deeper into fascism. So it is a great blessing to welcome the one and only Shane Claiborne. So friends, give a big round of applause, show your hands, give us some life here, wave, make Shane feel very welcome. So welcome, Shane. I'm going to mute myself, which is very difficult, but I'm going to do it in your honor, Shane.
Great. Thanks, buddy. It's really wonderful to be with all of you. Great to see you. I do a lot of these Zooms with with young folks too, and they love using the chat. So feel free to give a little whoop whoop, or throw a question in there. I'm gotten pretty good at multitasking with staying on track, but also following the chat. So, and I am from a bit of a charismatic background, as it'll be hard for me to hide it, and I don't really want to, but so you can throw a little hallelujah or a say that again sort of thing in there. But anyway, I grew up, as you can probably tell, in down south in the Bible Belt in Tennessee. I fell in love with Jesus in junior high school. I grew up Methodist, actually, and I went to this youth retreat, and I heard, these speakers talk about Jesus, and it really, really resonated in my soul. And they did an altar call, and we went forward really emotionally and had the whole born again experience. And then as my friend Tony Campolo says, that we began to go every year on these retreats, and we get born again. And I saw a pattern where Tony says we go to the altar singing "Just as I Am," and we leave just as we were, and keep living just like we always have. The next year you go and get born again. But I did have a really genuine love relationship with Jesus. I got tired of the Methodist Church, partly because the more I read the gospel, the more I began to believe in miracles, and I wanted to see. I just wanted people that acted like the Spirit was still alive. Now, I'm not busting on the whole Methodist Church, of course, but I did see this kind of paradox that we have the fire on the Methodist cross. That's the Methodist symbol, and yet I didn't feel a lot of that fire. So I heard about. I don't know if you've ever heard this, John, but I actually had some friends that were a part of a charismatic church, and my Methodist friends dared me to go over and ask them if they spoke in tongues. And because that was totally new to me, and so I went over to this table. These were like kind of transfer. There were a couple of guys that had transferred to our high school. And so I came over and I said, "Hey, word on the street is you guys are Pentecostals and you speak in tongues. Is that true?" And they were unfettered, and they said, "Yeah, absolutely, you should come to worship service one night." And so I took my Methodist friends, and we went to the charismatic church that, of course, met in like an old abandoned square warehouse, and to be honest, I loved it. I think some of my other Methodist friends were a little freaked out because they didn't go back, but I did. And I saw what I really believe were people being healed. I saw the Spirit move. I got rebaptized because they were like, "You can't do the sprinkling thing. That doesn't count. You got to go all the way under the water." So I got rebaptized. And then, even there, I saw some of the funk. We had a thing called Heaven's Gates and Hell's Flames, where we did these skits where, I don't know if you've ever seen this, but like we would do these skits where there would be a bus crash, and the demons would come and they would drag all the kids that didn't know Jesus to hell. And my friend's dad was the devil, and he was really good, and so it was very scary. And it really did feel like we were kind of scaring people into heaven, or into Jesus. And so I kept journeying, and I've still embraced a lot of that charismatic, Spirit-filled life. I've still embraced a lot of my Methodist roots too. I mean, heck, some of the really radical Methodist teaching is, similar to some of the Catholic teaching, right? John Wesley said, "If I should die with more than 10 pounds, may everybody call me a liar and a thief, because I betrayed the poor and I betrayed the gospel of Jesus." And of course, he said, "If I find money in my hands, I get rid of it as quick as I can before it corrupts my heart," and had this really radical social ethic. And I was talking to the Methodist bishops, and I said, "I guess the question is, if Jesus were alive today, or if John Wesley was alive today, rather, would he be a Methodist?" I guess it's John. It's like St. Francis when he recognized the Franciscan order that he started, right? But I love those roots, and so I've kind of held on to the best of those traditions and spit out the bones. But then I really wanted to get outside of East Tennessee, and just to give you, because we're all friends here, I'll just throw it all out there. I was prom king. I was, went to Sunday school every Sunday. I made straight A's in the dean's list and all this. And I was a good kid. But then I started really reading the things that Jesus said. If you want to be the greatest, become the least, sell everything you have and give it to the poor. And it really challenged me. And I was leaning into all that. And I heard of a little school up in Philadelphia called Eastern University. And that's where I headed. And I wanted to study the Bible. And I took my relationship with Jesus very seriously, but I also wanted to study sociology. So I studied with my friend, now my ministry partner, and kind of like a wild uncle of mine is Tony Campolo. Some of you may have known some of his work, and he and I started Red Letter Christians together. But before all of that, he was my sociology professor, and I like how Karl Barth said, we've got to read the Bible in one hand, but we've got to read the newspaper in the other, so that our faith doesn't just become a ticket into heaven and a license to ignore the world that we live in. And that's what I began to really lean into, was a faith that connected to this world. And some of you may know a little bit of the story of our community, but I'll just give you a few snapshots, and because I want to get to the nonviolent stuff that we're really diving into today. But during my second year of college, a couple of things happened. We heard about a group of homeless families, and these were mothers and children, the fastest growing homeless population in the US then and now. And they moved into this abandoned Catholic cathedral on the north side of Philly. And this Catholic, sanctuary had been abandoned for years, and they began living there. Sadly, the response of the Catholic Church was that you're trespassing on church property, and if you're not out within 48 hours, you could be arrested. And as young evangelicals, our immediate response was to have a prayer meeting, and we did that. And then we felt in one of the most profound and one of the most clearest times I can remember, throwing our hands up at God and saying, God, why don't you do something? And hearing God say back, I did do something. I made you. And we really felt compelled to get up off of our knees and to go down there after that prayer meeting. And I've never been the same since. That we went to the cathedral, and on the front of it, the families had hung a banner that said, how can we worship a homeless man on Sunday and ignore one on Monday? And they held a press conference. I mean, they were absolutely fearless, and they knew that they had very few options. And so they held a press conference, and they said, listen, we mean no disrespect to the Catholic Church or the Archdiocese, the Catholic officials, but we really don't have many options here. And we've actually been praying about it. And we talked to the owner of this building, the Lord Almighty. And God said we can stay, and they stayed, and we started a student movement that, came alongside of them. And of course, at this point, we're risking arrest. And John, this is the first time I've ever done anything like that. My mom is not happy. She's going, this is not how I raised you. Get back in your classes, and all that. But it was incredible. And you fast forward, that was 25 years ago. I got married in that old cathedral. And it's also where we, so much of our spirituality came to life. Of course, we read about St. Francis and Clare and Assisi and the youth movement that surrounded them. And literally, starting in an abandoned cathedral. And, here we are in an abandoned cathedral. And they heard that whisper to repair the church, which is in ruins. And so there were so many things that I began to really lean into. Many of my Catholic friends, they became mentors. In fact, there were Catholic nuns that used to teach and work in the school that were risking arrest too, or that were supporting the families being there. So it was wild, you know. In fact, our friend Sister Margaret McKenna, she's a medical mission sister. She's done Plowshares Actions. You know, she's a wild Catholic worker type nun, 90 years old now. And I can remember when we were in the cathedral and the families were living in the cathedral, she and other Catholic clergy and religious, nuns and priests went to the Archdiocese building and performed an exorcism, right? And they weren't joking. They were really serious, like these are principalities and powers, and they got arrested during that. So it was, it was just beautiful fusion of everything. And then I began, we started our community, which is called the Simple Way on the north side of Philadelphia, very much inspired by the Catholic workers. At the time, we had 2 or 3 different Catholic worker houses in Philadelphia, and still have the House of Grace that's there. And we began to live in that spirit of Dorothy Day and the workers and of the early church. We were really inspired by the movement in Assisi and Francis and Clare. We were really inspired by the early church in the book of Acts. So we began to share our possessions together, do hospitality, out of our homes. And I say all that to say that like my passion for nonviolence, it comes out of that context, right? And I didn't grow up with a theology or a foundation for nonviolence. My dad was in the military. Everybody in my family owned guns. I grew up hunting. And I grew up, a lot of my life supporting the death penalty and really believing that it had its roots in scripture. And so that does give me a lot of grace, with my fellow evangelical friends or with folks that see things really differently from me. And maybe, some of the folks listening in today, some of these ideas might be challenging. And so I think we need a lot of grace to realize that we're all working out our salvation with fear and trembling, as the scripture says. And that's what I've been doing for the last, few decades, really. But I can distinctly remember a few things that I want to share with you. There are many things that I love about my neighborhood. My neighborhood's called Kensington. And a lot of people call it the Badlands in Philadelphia. That's sort of its, nickname. And but I always correct people when they say that, because I say that's exactly what they said of Nazareth. Right? Nothing good could come from there. They called Nazareth the Badlands, and look who showed up, so we know that God shows up in the places we might think are the unlikely places. And so I see God show up all the time in Kensington. But we also have, one of the yet to be redeemed parts of our neighborhood is the gun violence. And I've posted on some of my social media, some of how gun violence has directly impacted us. And we just kept seeing people die, in our neighborhood and on the corners. And one of those in particular was a 19-year-old who I heard the gunshots and came out and saw him fall. He was still alive, but so I was, holding his hand, and I prayed with him, and he was taken by the ambulance. And we found out the next morning that he had died. 19 years old. His name was Papito. And it was after Papito died that I think I really began to resonate with Martin Luther King, when he said that we're all called to be the good Samaritan and lift our neighbor, out of the ditch on the road to Jericho. But after you lift so many people out of the ditch, you start to say, we need to rethink the whole road to Jericho. We need to do something about why people keep landing in the ditch. And so that year, it was during the season of Lent that Papito was that we were grieving that loss. And so we decided to do things differently, and we took our services into the streets. And in particular, there were stations of the cross on corners where people had died, connecting the violent execution of Jesus and his passion to the suffering of our streets. And on Good Friday, the young men in my neighborhood carried a really large wooden cross, and we carried it to the gun shop that's just around the corner. And this is not just any gun shop, the shooter shop, as it was called. is one of the notorious gun shops that is, irresponsibly trafficking guns into the streets, um, and over 200 guns, that have been used in violent crimes that have been tracked back there. Just a terrible place. And so we had our Good Friday service outside of it, and I'll never forget. We read the story of the from the gospel of Jesus's crucifixion and the women weeping at the foot of the cross. And then we really felt kind of moved by the Spirit to invite the mothers and family members of those who have died on our streets to share their stories. And it was powerful, y'all. It was like the tears of the mothers in Kensington met the tears of the mothers 2,000 years ago, and the passion of Christ met the passion of our corners. And after that, one of the women came up to me, and she's very emotional, and she said, I get it. I said, what? And she said, God knows what it feels like to lose your boy. God knows what it feels like to have your son killed. And I think that's one of the most powerful theological statements I've ever heard, better than anything I learned in seminary at Princeton, John. No offense to the seminarians, but I think that God knows what it feels like to lose your son. And I think that's part of how I've come to think of our how I understand Jesus, right? Is that there's a God that leaves all the comfort of heaven to join the struggle here on earth, and is born marginalized in every possible way, really, as a brown-skinned Palestinian Jewish refugee, in a violent world, as Herod is, massacring the children to try to get to Jesus, and all the way up to the point of his execution on the cross. Jesus is absorbing the violence of the world and putting that violence on display to subvert it with love and forgiveness and an empty tomb, even to the point where, Jesus feels the long loneliness, as Dorothy says, to the point of saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? So that's why I say to folks all the time, if you feel that long loneliness and even the absence of God, like we can rest in that solidarity of Jesus, that here's something to think about, right? That God felt the absence of God. Right? Chew on that for a minute. So that that Jesus, as the most profound act of divine solidarity to subvert the violence of the world, and literally every part of his life is a parody of power and a subversion of violence. And so that is the framework that fuels so much of what I do. And so we started doing a lot around gun violence in our neighborhood. And then September 11th happened. And that reframed things a little bit. We were already very involved in anti-militarism and the fight to end nuclear weapons, and yet 9/11 really was a moment that shook us, right? And I can remember in Philadelphia, someone hung a banner from City Hall, from our big City Hall building, iconic building downtown, that said, let's kill them all and let God sort them out. So there were responses like that, of course, that were out of people's grief and pain and anger and fear. That there was that response, but then there was other responses. And I can remember hearing about the family, what was known as the September 11th Families for Peaceful Tomorrows, folks in New York and DC who had lost their immediate loved ones in the attacks on 9/11, and yet their response was different, right? They got together originally as a support group, to grieve and to heal and to stand with one another. But then as they saw the response of the war, they became a really prophetic voice, and their motto became, our grief is not a cry for war. And many of them went on delegations to Iraq and Afghanistan. And I can remember shortly after hearing about all that, wrestling with what does it look like to follow Jesus when our government's getting ready to launch into a war. And that I had known Kathy Kelly and Voices in the Wilderness at the time a little bit. And she told me that there's a delegation to Iraq, and what I think about going on it. And that's one of those things that you pray about and you talk to your community and friends about. And so I really began to pray about that. And I decided I felt really, really clear on that call to go to Iraq. And I was in Baghdad it was a joint delegation of Voices in the Wilderness and Christian peacemaker teams. And we dozens of us, pastors, doctors, nurses, veterans, all kinds of young people, grandfathers and grandmothers. We were all there together in Iraq, and we weren't exactly sure how things would unfold, but we ended up being there as the bombing ensued, and the shock and awe campaign, as you may remember, in March of 2003, where at times there were more than 900 bombs a day that were falling on Baghdad. And so we lived in Baghdad, and we made the decision to stay. And I'll tell you one thing. I skipped, John. Before all of this, I had spent some time in India with Mother Teresa, and so I that was very formative for me. And maybe I'll talk about that later. But when we were in Baghdad, I noticed the nuns. They're very they stand out a little bit, and they have the blue and white saris, that are characteristic of the Missionaries of Charity. And we're going to this worship service just as the bombs started to fall in Baghdad, right? And I said to one of them, I said, "Hey, are you a Missionaries of Charity?" And she said, yeah, we are. And I said, well, I worked in India with Mother Teresa a bit, and we hit it all, we started talking. And I said, are you all going to leave, as the bombs fall? And I'll never forget what she said. She goes, well, no, of course not. The children can't leave. The orphans can't leave. We run an orphanage, so we're with them. We're here to stay. And I just, the like kind of winsome courage and resolve of that was so beautiful. And then this service that we went to, I will never forget. So this is just as the bombing was beginning, and this little church was packed out in Baghdad. Christians from all different denominations and backgrounds, and we worshiped together. It was so packed out, people couldn't get in, so they were just kind of overflowing into the streets, holding candles. And I'll never forget, all the bishops came up, and they had written a statement collaboratively that was addressed to Muslim friends, and it said, "We want you to know that we love you." And they said, "We know that we are from the same dysfunctional family." That goes all the way back to Abraham and Sarah. We are family. And they said, we're made from the same dirt of this earth that God breathed life into. And they said, we want you to know that we love you. And then one of the bishops pointed to the cross and said, this cross makes no sense to the wisdom of this world, as scripture says, but it makes no sense to smart bombs. But the cross, it teaches us the narrow way that leads to life. And the cross shows us God's love on display. And it's this cross that is the center of our faith. And then the whole place started singing Amazing Grace in Arabic, y'all. And I remember just being, the charismatic side of me. I'm just like got the chill bumps, my hair standing up, and I was compelled really to go to the altar afterwards. I mean, we're all praying, and then I'm talking to one of the bishops, and of course I'm roused up, and I'm talking really fast, and I said, "Bishop, this is so powerful. I can feel the spirit moving here," and then I said, in my excitement, I said something really ignorant. I said, "I had no idea there's so many Christians in Baghdad." And the bishop said, "Yes." And he was very gentle. He goes, "This is where it started." And he pointed out the window and he goes, "That's the Tigris River. That's the Euphrates. Have you heard of them?" And he said, "The Garden of Eden is right down the road. He says, you know, Jonah's buried right over here. And he said, this is the land of your ancestors. And I'll never forget what he said next. You didn't invent Christianity in America. You just domesticated it. And he said, you go back and you tell the Christians in the United States that we are praying for them. We're praying for them to remember who they are, to proclaim Jesus, and to be faithful to what he said. You live by the sword, you die by the sword. And then he started giving me this like encore message. You know, I got a bonus sermon from him. But I remember, you know, thinking about the words of Martin Luther King, as he said, that these are extreme times that we live in. And of course, this, you know, he said this over 50 years ago. These are extreme times that we're living in. And the question isn't whether or not we will be extremists, but what kind of extremists will we be? Will we be extremists for love or extremists for hatred? And the world has seen enough extremists for hatred, right? And certainly evangelicals, you know, we've seen all kinds of folks distort our faith with hatred and hijack the headlines, bombing abortion clinics, or, you know, carrying guns in the streets, or trying to baptize bombs or whatever. And so I think, you know, we've seen that. But I think the question that Dr. King raises is, what does it look like to be extremist for love? And that's why I love, you know, hanging out with Father John, and being with all of you, and Dorothy Day, and the Berrigans, and so many others that have shown us what it looks like to be an extremist for love. And that was the founding of the Christian Peacemaker teams. I don't know how much you all know about that, but you know, in 1984, when the Christian Peacemaker teams were founded, my friend and really great friend of mine, Ron Sider, you know, he gave a speech at the Mennonite World Conference, and he said, unless we are prepared to risk injury and death in nonviolent opposition to the injustice our societies foster, then we don't dare even whisper another word about pacifism to our sisters and brothers in desperate lands. And this is Ron Sider. He said, unless we're ready to die developing new nonviolent attempts to reduce international conflict, we should confess that we never really meant the cross was an alternative to the sword. Making peace is as costly as waging war. And unless we are prepared to pay the cost of peacemaking, we have no right to claim the label or preach the message. So those strong words, you know, gave birth to the Christian Peacemaker teams and continue to fuel the work that they do. So I came back and I'll leave out a little bit, but we you know, we had a car accident coming out of Iraq where we were our car flipped over and we were all injured, and these Iraqi doctors saved our lives. And that experience also was so formative for us that, I mean, you know, now I read the Good Samaritan story with very different eyes, you know, and we had a chance to go back and to visit those doctors, and we tried to keep in touch with that little town called Rutba. One of our communities was named after that little town in the Anbar province, a community down in North Carolina here. So that experience in Iraq was really, really formative. And even, you know, now I have a piece of shrapnel from one of the bombs that was dropped on Baghdad, and you know, that's here on my desk. But I also have a casing of a bullet from our block in Philadelphia, and it doesn't feel that disconnected, right? And I think of Martin Luther King when he said, Dr. King used to talk about, you know, how we try to tell young people that violence will not solve their problems. But then they ask us, Dr. King said, why does our government use massive doses of violence to try to bring the change that it wants to see in the world? And Dr. King said, I knew that I could no longer speak against the violence of the kids in our ghettos without speaking against the violence of our government, what he called the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. And so when I got home from Iraq, check this out, y'all, the young people on our block had decorated the sidewalk with sidewalk chalk They had written on the sidewalk, "War no more, love our enemies." And to me, it was just one of those moments where everything connected, right? That the same work that we're doing in North Philadelphia to end gun violence is the work that we're doing in Iraq and Afghanistan and all over the world in conflict zones to try to be peacemakers. In fact, one of the most beautiful things that we did was I don't know if I've ever told you this, John, but we did a Skype call with the young people in our neighborhood with the Afghan peace volunteers in Kabul in Afghanistan. And this was very early on before John and I had been to Kabul to visit them. And uh, it was unbelievable to hear these 15, 16-year-olds in North Philadelphia share their dreams for the kind of world that they want to build and live in. And to hear the kids in Afghanistan saying the exact same thing, right? Dreaming the exact same dreams, finishing each other's sentences, right? And when we were over in Afghanistan, I had a chance to show a little slideshow of some pictures of the work, that we're doing in Philadelphia. And when Michael Brown was killed, this is just how small the world is, y'all. So when Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, the kids in Afghanistan asked us to take a flower for them and a blue scarf, because that was the symbol that they used, that we have one blue sky to connect us all. And they said, would you take a blue scarf and a flower and put it at the memorial in Ferguson from us in Kabul? Isn't that something? I mean, so and that's what I think has happened is our world in many ways is kind of shrunk to where we can see the Arab Spring, we can see what's happening on the other side of the world. And there's a global movement that's speaking out and in the streets, declaring that Black lives matter, that Palestinian lives matter, that every human being is made in the image of God. And so I think it's an amazing time to be alive. And the last thing I want to have plenty of time for dialogue. So I just a couple of other things on our more recent work are that as I started to look back, there's a few things that I've realized as we think about peacemaking and the Beatitudes. One of them that I would offer us today is that proximity makes all the difference in the world. That it's no coincidence that the fire in my bones to end gun violence came from living in a neighborhood that is absolutely plagued by gun violence. Martin Luther, one of my friends, Derek Webb, he wrote a song called, it talks about how the church is really good at moving out of the neighborhoods that Jesus moved into. Right. And so it said, God's been good. I've finally been able to move out of Jesus's neighborhood. And it talks about, the way that we move away from the streets where people get beat up. In many ways, I think proximity is what happened in Jesus. And everything in our world is teaching us to move away from the places where people get beat up, the places where injustice happens, the places where there are people who don't look like us that live there, and yet the gravity of the gospel calls us into those places. As my friend Tony Campolo says, God is not saying to the folks on death row, come find the church. But God's saying to us, go into the prisons, go into the maximum security facilities. And to me, that's what has fueled my fire on the death penalty. I've been getting to know a lot of folks on death row, and I actually have a little letter. I've got a bunch of letters from different folks I write with, but this is one I hold in my Bible. And this is a guy that was on death row that was later taken off of death row. It says, just as I was sealing up this letter to you, he says, I was moved off death row after 30 years, 3 decades on death row. And he says, this is what he says right here. I just walked on grass a few seconds ago for the first time in 30 years. And he says, God is so great. I mean, so this is what we are doing to people, right? That he walked on grass for the first time in 30 years. And it's that, that proximity that I think what I've realized in the church is that I'm pretty sure that we don't just have a compassion problem, but we have a proximity problem. It's a geographical thing. It's a relational thing. It's not that folks don't care about those who are suffering. It's often that we don't know them. Mother Teresa had a great line. She said, it can be very fashionable to talk about the poor, but is not as fashionable to talk to them. Right. And I think the church is very good at caring about the poor, and having good theology, but we're not always in those spaces visiting folks in prison, or in those spaces where folks are struggling from gun violence. And so proximity makes a really big difference. And then I've really been challenging our this is less so with you all, I think with many of you who claim, are Catholic, but in the evangelical church especially, we've come to think so narrowly about what it means to be pro-life, that we would really be more accurate to say that we're pro-birth, or we're anti-abortion. As if like life begins at conception and ends at birth. As someone said, you want to stay in the womb as long as possible, because as soon as you're born, a lot of the pro-lifers are going to abandon you. So I wanted a better ethic of life. And that's what my recent writing has been about. The reason I wrote Executing Grace about the death penalty is that the death penalty has survived in America, not in spite of Christians, but because of us. If Christians resolved to stop killing, the death penalty would be done overnight. And just to be clear, it's not just evangelicals. I mean, the Bible Belt is the death belt, right? 90% of executions happen in the Bible Belt, but half of them happen in Texas. And Governor Abbott is a professing Catholic, right? So I think those on the Supreme Court, someone said, do we need less Christians on the Supreme Court? I said, no, we just need the folks that say they're a Christian to act more like Jesus, to hold to the Beatitudes, blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. So that's, and there is a theology that is more prevalent in the evangelical church of understanding why Jesus died. One version of the way that we understand Jesus's death is sort of like God's got a gun pointed at humanity, and God takes it off of us and points it on Jesus and kills Jesus so that we could live. And it's a very dangerous theology, right? That still kind of makes God into a God that is easy to fear, but hard to love and hard to understand, that we end up justifying violence because of that theology. And I think, I won't go too deep into that, but that's why, I wrote Executing Grace, and I wrote Beating Guns, because Christians are the highest gun owning demographic in America. Oh, right. We own guns at a higher rate than the general population. And I know that this is a little bit more of a evangelical thing, but we've got these Bible covers that my friend Rob Shank gave me this, and I talk about guns as a form of idolatry, and certainly our military weapons are too, our nuclear weapons. The whole some may trust in chariots, some may trust in horses, right? But this is a Bible case that literally it is one of the top selling Bible cases in America. And it doesn't look like much. I said, okay, cool. It looks like the Bible case I had in high school. And he says, open it up. And you open it up, and look at this, y'all. It is actually a concealed carry case. It is designed for one purpose. I've got a plastic gun in there, but this is, marketed to Christians. It is a great icon of idolatry, right? That we literally the folks that are worshiping the Prince of Peace on Sunday are packing heat on Monday, right? We are the ones that are trying to hold the cross in one hand and a gun in the other. And it became impossible for me to reconcile my love for Jesus and this idea of loving our enemies with simultaneously preparing to kill them, whether that means, a gun or a bomb. And I believe that, Cyprian says it so well, the Bishop of Carthage, he said, when an individual kills another individual, we call it evil, as we should. But when the state does it in mass, we sanctify it and we call it good. And Cyprian points out the great irony, right? That we know it's wrong for an individual to kill, but some of us don't know that it's wrong for the state to kill. And it's just as wrong for a governor or a president or a prime minister to kill as it is for a criminal in the streets. And so I think that's, that fuels my passion for nonviolence. And it's why, I'm writing a book that kind of connects all those dots now around a more consistent ethic of life that's fueled by this passion that every person is made in the image of God. The other image that I'll leave you with, as we open up the conversation, is that, that image of beating swords into plows and spears into pruning hooks. It inspires the plowshares movement. And it's also an image that inspired the early church. I've got a list of all of the sermons that were preached on the swords into plows verse from Isaiah and Micah. And the early Christians really saw this as the vocation of the church, right? That we are to fulfill this prophecy of turning from death to life, of literally repurposing metal that was designed to kill into metal that's designed to cultivate life. We're to beat swords into plows. And just as Jesus turned a cross, which was only known as an instrument of torture and horror and humiliation, and now we think of it as a conduit of God's love. It's been subverted, the empire's icon of killing, into a conduit of God's love. And so now we are to be people that are transforming the world in a similar way. And as Walter Brueggemann said, in his wonderful book, The Prophetic Imagination, he's a dear friend and he loves, the work that we're doing, transforming guns. He said, when we think of the prophets, sometimes we think of them as fortune tellers, trying to predict the future. And that's not it. The prophets weren't trying to predict the future. They were trying to change it. And they weren't fortune tellers. They were truth tellers. They were trying to wake us up, right? And invite us to imagine a different future from where we are headed right now. What I love about the swords to plows scripture is that it does end by saying nation will not rise up against nation. They will study war no more. But peace doesn't begin from the top. It bubbles up from the bottom, right? It's not the kings and presidents that lead the way to peace and the politicians and legislators, right? They're the ones that keep declaring war, and keep funding the military. It's the people who get fed up and they take things into their own hands and they begin to transform their weapons into garden tools. And so that's what we're doing, y'all. And I brought you a few visuals, a little show and tell. This is a shovel that is made out of a donated gun, and even the wood is made from the wood stock of the gun. This is a cross that is made out of the barrel of a gun. John, if I haven't gotten you one of these, I need to get you one. But and then we make these heart necklaces out of guns, and that's out of a slice of a gun barrel. And this is my favorite. I'll show you a couple of these. These are our plows that we make. This is made, the entire thing's made out of a gun. And so I'm an apprenticing blacksmith now. My wife is too. I like this one because you can still see what it used to be. That's so beating guns into plows is a part of what we're doing now. But we've done this all over the country. And I'll have to say that it is symbolic and poetic, but I've also found that it's sacramental. And I don't use that word lightly. But one of the first times that we beat a gun into a plow, I'll never forget this mother. She had a picture of her son who was killed in Philly in a random stray bullet. And as she began to beat on the gun, she said, "This is for my boy." And you got the sense that she wasn't just transforming a piece of metal, but she was prophetically participating in the transformation of the world. And as we've traveled all over the country, we've had veterans uh, that have beaten on guns. We've had the family of Tamir Rice, who was killed by police, in Ohio, that have beaten on guns. We had Sharon Risher, whose family was massacred by Dylan Roof in the Emmanuel AME Church, and she named all 9 of them as she was beating on the gun. And so that, I think that's part of what we need today, is we've got to find ways that we can use the pain and the anger and use it for transformation. So that's just one very literal way that we're doing that. But I think it also is a reminder that this world doesn't have to be this way, right? It doesn't. Metal can be transformed, so can a heart. Someone who is killed, their heart can be transformed. Streets that are riddled with violence, like Philadelphia right now. We had over 530 murders last year. I didn't catch the exact number. I mean, it just got so astronomical, the highest it's been in 30 years. So we're going to be doing this all over Philadelphia, transforming guns into garden tools. But that's let me stop there. I'm so honored to be with my friend and my brother John, and all of you, to make some new friends and dream these dreams together and see what we can do. So let me stop. Bless you all.